Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be sewing. We're going to be sewing along to Mccalls 8001. Here's the pattern right here, and I'm going to be following along with view B on this pattern. If you missed my sewing plans and pattern preview video, you can click right here to check that out. In that video, I went over the pattern instructions. I talked about the size I'm going to be cutting and why, and I also shared the fabric that I'll be using. So if you want to follow along with me and make this top, again, the pattern is Mccalls 8001. Go ahead and cut out your pattern pieces, transfer all of your markings, and let's get started sewing. To get started on our top, the first thing that we're going to do is start to work on our back pattern piece. You should have transferred some circles, so if you didn't transfer those, make sure that you go back and transfer them. They're really important. I also made some snips where my circles are, so I'll be able to know just another notation of where the circles are. First thing that we're going to do is take the smaller circles and we're going to bring them over to the larger ones. So right here are the smaller ones and we're just going to bring them over. And you can pin it in place. Again, I'm using the clips at the top that I placed right where my dots are to match it up just a little bit easier. And then pin it in place. Once you have it pinned, we're just going to baste right across the upper edge to keep the fold in place. Now that we have basted the pleat in place, your pleat should look like this. You want to go ahead and give it a press and then grab one of your yokes. Taking one of your yoke pattern pieces, you're going to place it right sides facing to the top. You want to match up your notches and pin it in place. Once you have the yoke pinned to the back, you can go ahead and baste it in place. Now that we have basted on one of our yoke pattern pieces, you want to go ahead and grab the other yoke, and we're going to do the same steps, except we're going to make sure that we pin it to the wrong side of our back pattern piece. So make sure that you have the wrong side of your fabric facing up. We're going to put our yoke right sides facing down. So you should have your right to the back and it should look like this. Let's go ahead and match up our notches and pin this yoke in place. When you have your yoke pinned, you can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. With the yoke sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seam. Once it's trimmed, go ahead and press your seam. Now that we have pressed our yoke seams, your top should look like this. So this is the inside, wrong side of the garment, and this right here is the right side of the garment. Our next step is to stitch our front and back together along the shoulder seams. So go ahead and grab your front pattern pieces. So with the right sides facing, we're going to match up our notches and pin our shoulder seams together. You want to make sure that you have your facing yoke out of the way, and we're only stitching together the front and the back shoulder seam. Grab some pins and pin in place. Once you have one shoulder seam pinned, you want to pin the other shoulder seam the same way. With both shoulder seams pinned together, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And remember to make sure that your yoke facing is not attached, that you only have your back and your front pinned. Now that we have the shoulders sewn, I'm not going to trim the seams off just yet. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the yoke facing to it. So with the wrong sides facing out, these are my fronts right here. Wrong sides are facing out. I have dropped down the yoke facing. I'm going to do the burrito method to go ahead and close up the yoke facing. So with my garment facing like this, I'm going to tuck and roll as you would a burrito. And as you continue to roll, you will begin to see your yoke facing right here. So I'm just going to bring this over and roll it and bring it up here to the shoulders. Now I can pin this in place, matching up my notches. Make sure that your garment is still rolled and tucked down and that you're only pinning together these shoulder seams. We're going to pin the other shoulder seam the same way, making sure that the garment is still rolled and tucked in, and we're just bringing the yoke facing over to match the shoulder, matching up your notches, and we're going to pin it in place. After it's pinned, you can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have the yoke facing sewn to the shoulders, we can go ahead and trim our seam allowance. Do a quick check though to make sure you didn't catch in any of your fabric before you trim your seam. With your seams trimmed, we can go ahead and flip the top right side out. So just gently pull your top out. So now this is what our seam looks like on the inside. We have sewn the yoke to the shoulder seams at the top. So again, this is the inside of the garment and this is the outside of the garment. Now we can go ahead and give our seams a press. Now that we have pressed our shoulder seams, next we're going to put the garment right sides together. And we're going to pin and sew our side seams. Now we can go ahead and stitch our side seams at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you can finish off your edges with your serger or however you like to finish off the edges of your garment. Now that we have our side seams sewn, you can see here I finished mine off with my serger. The next step is to go ahead and start to work on our hem band, and that's pattern piece 6 and 7. With right sides together, I'm going to match up by notches, and I'm going to pin my side seams of the hem band together. So you should have transferred markings at the side as well as at the top of your pattern piece number 6, so make sure that that notch at the top is facing up. Once you have them right sides facing, you can go ahead and pin your side seams of your hem band together. Now that the side seams of the hem band are pinned, we can go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then I am going to press my seams open flat. Go ahead and press your seam open once you have it sewn. While you're at the iron, on the unnotched edge, we're going to press under 5/8 of an inch, and then we'll trim that down to 3/8 of an inch. If you need to, you can grab a seam gauge to measure up 5/8 of an inch, and then press your hem in place. Once you've pressed up your hem allowance and trimmed it down, now we can go ahead and pin this to the lower edge of our bodice. So with the right sides facing, we can match up our side seams and notches and pin in place. With the hem band pinned on to the bodice, let's go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After you've stitched it together, trim down your seam allowance. Next, after you trimmed your seam allowance, you want to press the seam going down toward the hem band. Once you've pressed your seam allowance down toward the hem band, next you want to go ahead and fold up the hem band along the fold line. And this pressed edge right here, we are going to place it right over that seam just to encase the seam allowance. So it should look like this once you have it all folded up. I'm going to put mine past it by maybe like 1/8 because I'm going to stitch in the ditch to catch in this raw edge. If you want to slip stitch yours, you can place it right on top of the stitch, but I'm just going to put mine a little past it just so I'll be able to stitch in the ditch. Now once you have it folded up along the fold line, go ahead and press it. With the hem band folded up along the fold line, because I'm going to stitch in the ditch, I am going to place pins along the right side of my fabric, making sure that I catch in the pressed edge on the inside. So right here in this seam, I am placing a pin, and I'm going to make sure that I've caught it on the inside. And I'm just going to continue doing that all the way along the hem band. Once you have your hem band pinned, we can go ahead and stitch in the ditch. You can top stitch it if you like. And again, you do have the option to just slip stitch it in place. Let's go ahead and stitch our hem band now. So I have stitched mine in a ditch, and this is what the inside of my stitch looks like here. And this is what the outside of it looks like. Once you have yours stitched down, let's move on to the next step. On the front band pattern pieces, you want to go ahead and press in our seam allowance on the unnotched edge. I've done so on both of these. So one edge has a notch on it. On the other side, you want to press in 5/8 of an inch and then trim that down to 3/8 of an inch. So go ahead and do that to both of your front band pattern pieces. Next, you want to fold the front band along the fold line. I'm going to place a pin right here to hold it in place. At this point, with the seam allowance folded in and trimmed, it shouldn't match. So fold it along the fold line like so. And now we're going to stitch across the bottom edge at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Again, this is the bottom of the front band. The top is where the notch is and the marking that you transferred. So make sure that you fold it over at the bottom along the fold line, and now we can stitch across at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. With it sewn, you want to go ahead and trim your corners, trim your seam allowance down. And now we can flip it right sides out, and we can give it a press. Now that the front bands are pressed, you want to go ahead and grab your top, and we're going to match up our notch and pin the front band in place. Once you have it pinned, you can go ahead and pin your other front band the same way and then stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once it's sewn, go ahead and trim your seam and then press it toward the front band. Now that the seam allowance is pressed going toward the front band, you can slip stitch this closed if you like, or you can put pins in the same way that we did for the lower hem band, and then you can do a stitch in the ditch or a top stitch if you like. Once you have your front band stitched closed, this is what the inside of my front band looks like here. And this is what it looks like on the outside of the top. Once you have it sewn, go ahead and give it a good press. And then we want to go ahead and do an edge stitch right along this other side of the band. I'm not going to edge stitch mine, but you can edge stitch yours if you like. The next step after you've done the edge stitching is to go ahead and do stay stitching around the neck edge to prepare it for the collar. First thing to do is to grab our collar pieces, lay it right sides facing, and we're going to pin along the sides the edge that is unnotched and the other side. So let's go ahead and pin now, being sure to leave the side that has the double notches open. Once we have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Again, be sure to leave the notched edge open and free. With it sewn, go ahead and trim your seam. Once it's trimmed, go ahead and flip your collar right side out. If you have a point turner, you can use that to poke out your corners. Now that it's flipped out, go ahead and give it a press, and then you can baste the raw edges together. Now that you have your collar pressed, you want to go ahead and grab your collar band pieces. You should have cut out two. One is uninterfaced and one is interfaced. On the uninterfaced collar band, you're going to press up 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the single notched edge. So you should have one edge with double notches and the other edge to have single notches. On the single notch edge, go ahead and press up your seam allowance and trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. Once you have it trimmed down and it looks like this, we can move on to the next step. Now let's go ahead and put our collar together. So I have my interface collar band down facing up. I'm going to put my uninterfaced collar right sides down to the collar band like so. So this is interfaced, the uninterfaced side of the collar. So here you can take a look. This side is uninterfaced, this side is interfaced. I have that down like so. And now I'm going to take the uninterfaced collar band and lay that down. Now we can match up our notches and pin in place. With your collar and collar band pinned, it should look similar to this. Now we're going to go ahead and stitch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way along the double notched edge, being sure to leave this side open. Now that your collar and collar band is sewn together, we can go ahead and trim our seam and then flip it right side up. Now with the collar turned right side out and pressed, we can go ahead and pin it to our top. So you want to find your neckline, match up your notches with your collar, pin in place. Now that it's pinned, you can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that you have it stitched on, you want to trim down your seam, press it going up, and then you can slip stitch or stitch in the ditch your collar band, however you prefer to do that. Go ahead and close up your collar band now. Alright, I have my collar sewn on, and I did the stitch in the ditch the same way that I did for the front band as well as for my lower band. I did not slip stitch mine in place, but you can do whatever works best for you. So now that the collar is stitched on and you've given it a press, now we can go ahead and put the top to the side and start to work on our sleeve band. For our sleeve band, pattern piece number 11, we're going to fold them right sides facing, match up your notches, and pin in place. Go ahead and pin the other sleeve band the same way, then we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have your sleeve band stitched, you want to press your seam open flat, and now we're going to fold it with wrong sides facing. You want to match up your seam and match up your notches and pin the raw edges together. Now with it pinned in place, you can go to the machine and do a basting stitch, or if your fabric holds a press well, you can just go ahead and press it. I'm going to press mine. This fabric is holding heat well, but again, you can just baste around the raw edges now that you have them pinned. But go ahead and do that now if you want to baste it or just press it in place. Now that you have pressed or basted your raw edges together for your sleeve band, we can go ahead and attach it to our top. So you should have transferred a large circle on your sleeve band that matches up to the shoulder seam on your top. So with right side spacing, let's go ahead and match up our seam, match up our notch, and match up the shoulder seam and pin our sleeve band in place. Once you have the sleeve bands pinned on, we can go ahead and stitch them at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then you want to finish off your raw edge. I'm going to finish mine off with my serger. So let's go ahead and do that now. Once you have sewn the sleeve band on and you have finished off the raw edges, I finished off mine with my serger. The last step for us to do is to go ahead and sew on our buttonholes and attach our buttons. Since all of our machines are different, please refer to your manual for how to stitch on your buttonholes. So once you have those on and you sew on your buttons, you're all done with your top. Well, that is all for the video. I really do hope that you all enjoyed it and that it was easy for you to follow along with. If you have any questions, please leave them down for me below. If you make this top, please tag me over on Instagram at Brittany J. Jones. I would love to see it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next video, and I will see you all then. Blessings, everyone. Bye.